The palace never expected the truth to escape its walls. Not like this. Not in the form of a DNA report that ripped open 6 decades of secrets in a single, undeniable sentence. And yet here we are, standing at the edge of a royal revelation so explosive that even seasoned insiders admitted they'd never seen Buckingham Palace this rattled. One staff member whispered, almost trembling, that the atmosphere felt like a funeral for a lie that lived too long. What lie was so big, so deeply buried, that its death could shake a monarchy? Tonight, you'll hear the answer. But before we dive into it, I need to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed a moment where a single truth threatened to rewrite an entire family's legacy? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because that is exactly what this story is about. Picture this. It's early morning in London. Overcast skies. A chill so sharp it seems to warn that something historic is coming. Inside Buckingham Palace, a sealed envelope arrives on a silver tray. A tray typically used for state correspondence, coronation notes, or the Queen's personal communications. Not for this. Never for this. The footman who carried it reportedly walked slower than usual, glancing down at the envelope again and again, as though afraid it might burn through his hands. The envelope contained a DNA report confirming, and this is the part no one was prepared for, that Prince Andrew is not the biological son of Prince Philip. That's not a rumor. That's not speculation. That was the official finding. You may think you've heard whispers about this before. The tabloids, the conspiracy threads, the curious timelines. But none of those had the palace's accidental confirmation, the internal panic, or the final statement that London journalists are saying may be the most consequential royal message released since the abdication crisis of 1936. And yet, before we unravel how the palace responded, before we decode that final statement, we have to go back. Back to the moment the royal family first sensed that something didn't add up. Because this isn't a recent rumor. This isn't a sudden revelation. This is a story that has been buried for decades, wrapped in silence, protected by status, and dismissed as fantasy until science finally said otherwise. But why now? Why did the palace choose this moment, of all moments, to release a statement they've avoided for years? To answer that, we need to understand the climate. The royal institution is more fragile than ever. Trust is thin. Public scrutiny is relentless. And every family member, every decision, every secret is endlessly examined, questioned, magnified. Combine that with global digital culture, where information travels from whispers to wildfire in minutes, and you get a perfect storm, one in which the palace can no longer bury what it used to hide effortlessly. In fact, insiders say that for the first time in modern royal history, the communications team wasn't worried about public anger. They were worried about public disbelief. The truth was almost too big to accept, too dramatic, too destabilizing. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the father everyone believed was yours wasn't. Now imagine that revelation being splashed across global headlines, debated in Parliament, analyzed by legal experts, legacy historians, genealogists, and every relative who suddenly looks at you differently. That's what Prince Andrew faced. Like him or hate him, this is a seismic human moment. And yet, in the palace's eyes, this wasn't just about Andrew. This wasn't even about Philip. This was about lineage, the most sacred currency in the monarchy. But let me ask you this. What happens to a monarchy built on bloodlines when a bloodline breaks? That question, that single terrifying question, is what sparked chaos within palace walls. And that leads us to the most unsettling part, the palace's final statement. A statement so carefully worded, so strategically vague, yet so revealing that even the most loyal royal correspondents were stunned. The phrase, final statement, was not chosen lightly. It suggested finality, closure, a line drawn in the sand. It was as if the palace wanted to say, this is all you're getting, don't ask for more. But the public did ask for more, because the statement didn't explain the timing. It didn't explain who initiated the DNA test. It didn't explain the internal reactions. And it certainly didn't explain why several senior staff reportedly cried, yes, cried, when they heard the results. There's something raw and deeply human about this moment. A family forced to confront a truth they've outrun for over 60 years. a son whose identity has been fractured, a monarchy whose image is now under the harshest spotlight imaginable. And yet, even with all that, there is something else hidden beneath the surface. Something almost no one is talking about yet. Because the palace's final statement has a missing piece, a piece they intentionally left out, a piece that, according to insiders, might change how we see the Queen's early reign and the pressures placed on her in the 1950s and 1960s. But let's slow down. Because before this revelation reached the press, before the palace even drafted a statement, there were small signs, subtle cracks, that hinted at deeper truths. A doctor's odd recollection, a photographer's strange comment, a royal aide's anxious smile whenever Andrew's birth year was mentioned. These details went unnoticed for decades. But in hindsight, they paint a picture, a pattern, a trail. And that trail leads to the very beginning of this story, to the rumor that never quite went away. What rumor? That Prince Andrew's biological father might not be Prince Philip. Most people dismissed it. But there were always a few who insisted the timelines didn't align. That the friendships were too close. That the Queen's behavior around certain individuals was unusually warm, even for her. Still, without hard evidence, these were nothing more than whispers drifting through the palace corridors. But here's what changed everything. Prince Andrew himself wanted answers. Not the press. Not jealous courtiers. Not rivals. Andrew. And if that surprises you, you're not alone. Because the question people are asking now is, what finally pushed him to demand the DNA test? Was it health concerns? Legal pressure? Personal guilt? Emotional turmoil? An identity crisis? Or something else? Something that insiders hinted was far more complicated. However, before any of those questions could be answered, the DNA results forced the palace into a decision: hide it or confront it. For decades, their strategy was always silence. Silence protects. Silence survives. Silence never denies, but never confirms. A quiet palace is a powerful palace. But silence was impossible this time. Too many staff members knew. Too many advisors were aware. And too many outside parties had seen documents the palace couldn't retrieve or destroy. So the palace chose something radical. Something they never usually choose. They chose to speak. And that is why the final statement exists. Too little to satisfy the public. Too late to preserve the myth. Too carefully written to not raise questions. And too heavy with subtext to ignore. But what made this moment urgent? What forced the palace's hand after decades of avoidance? It wasn't just the DNA. It wasn't just Andrew. It wasn't just Philip. It was the leak. Someone, and we'll get into who, disclosed that the DNA test had happened. Not the results. Not the details. Not the royal fallout. Only that the test existed. And in that single moment, everything changed. Because the one thing the palace fears more than scandal is losing control of the narrative. Imagine the panic. Advisors rushing down corridors. Phones ringing nonstop. Senior figures whispering in private rooms. Every department, legal, communications, protocol, archives, scrambling. One insider said it felt like a dam breaking in slow motion. You see it. You hear it. You feel it. But you can't stop it. And that is where our story truly begins. Because the palace didn't just confirm a rumor. They confirmed an identity crisis that stretches back to Andrew's birth. And they did it at a moment so delicate, so politically charged, so historically symbolic, that it immediately triggered global shock. But let me ask you one more question before we move on. What if the palace's final statement wasn't actually final? What if it was only the beginning? What if they revealed just enough to satisfy the public, but held back the one detail that could rewrite royal history even more violently? Because according to sources close to the situation, they did. And that missing detail, the one the palace refused to put in writing, is the reason we are starting this journey today. Because without understanding that single missing piece, the rest of this story won't make sense. But before we get there, before we uncover the hidden truth inside this scandal, we must go to the first chapter, the rumor that refused to die. Because buried inside that rumor was the first crack in the royal facade. And once that crack formed, the truth began to slip through, slowly at first, then all at once. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The rumor that wouldn't die, decades of whispered doubt. The truth never detonates all at once. It leaks. It drips. It stains the edges of a story long before anyone dares to speak it aloud. So let me ask you this. If a rumor refuses to die for more than 60 years, is it still a rumor? Or is it a warning no one wanted to hear? Because long before the DNA test, long before the palace drafted their final statement, the truth about Prince Andrew's parentage had already begun haunting Buckingham Palace. Quietly, patiently, persistently, it lingered in the corners of hallways. It slipped into late-night staff conversations. It circled state dinners like an invisible ghost. A ghost no one could see, but everyone felt. And that's where we begin. The palace, as polished and powerful as it appears on the outside, is built on whispers. Whispered traditions, whispered instructions, whispered fears. But the whisper about Prince Andrew was different. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't gossipy. It wasn't born from scandal-seeking courtiers. It was born from observation. Something isn't right, a chamberlain reportedly said back in the mid-1970s. A simple line, a quiet observation. But that line became a tune that echoed through decades. Let's rewind further. Imagine being a footman in the late 1960s. The Queen is radiant. Prince Philip is striking, commanding, unmistakably sharp-featured. Their first two children, Charles and Anne, carry clear traits from both parents. Even as toddlers, their resemblance is noted, painted, photographed, praised. Then comes Andrew, a beautiful baby, a joyful baby, a perfectly healthy baby, but not a familiar-looking baby. Not to everyone. Some staff noticed it immediately. Some denied noticing anything. Others forced themselves not to notice, because noticing was dangerous. Noticing invited questions. And questions, inside a palace built on silence, can cost you more than your job. Yet, the whispers persisted. They grew stronger each year, each family portrait, each comparison. It wasn't due to anything Andrew did. He was a child, innocent, loved, protected. This wasn't about him. It was about what people couldn't explain, a disconnect they couldn't rationalize. And that disconnect seeped into the palace like humidity. You don't see it at first, but you feel it. And once it's inside, it's impossible to ignore. Ask yourself, how does a rumor survive that long in a place obsessed with appearances? Because rumors only survive when something real is feeding them. One former maid, who worked in the palace for over 25 years, recalled a moment that she said forever stuck with her. It was during a photo session. The family was gathered, dressed for a Christmas portrait. She was assisting with adjusting the children's outfits. Charles and Anne stood near their father. Andrew was off to the side. She remembered hearing a photographer mutter, half-jokingly, "The Duke has two types, and one wild card." The room went silent. The photographer claimed it was just a joke, but palace officials immediately pulled him aside. His contract was not renewed the following year. Coincidence? Or a quiet correction to keep the whispers manageable? Let's talk about Philip for a moment. Prince Philip was known for his dry humor, his bluntness, and his surprisingly emotional moments behind closed doors. But when it came to Andrew, several insiders noted that Philip was different. Not cold, not detached, but unusually formal, reserved, almost cautious. One aide described it as affection with a filter. But here's where things become even more interesting. Staff who worked closely with Philip never heard him refer to Andrew as "my son" in private conversations. Not once. Not one recorded moment. In public, he played the role expected of him. But behind the scenes? Silence. Do you think that silence was intentional or accidental? More importantly, do you think silence can hide truth forever? Now let's shift to a moment that, in hindsight, should have set off alarms. It was the early 1980s. A handful of royal staff were reorganizing old photo archives in a back office. These were private, unpublicized photos, moments captured away from public view. According to a retired archivist, one of the staff members pulled out an envelope marked simply, 1960, private. Inside were candid photos of the Queen at a countryside retreat. Casual, unstaged, natural. And in several of those photos, another man appeared beside her. A man who was not Philip. His name was quietly murmured among staff long before the DNA scandal. A decorated officer. Dignified. Protective. A man close to the Queen at a time when Philip was often abroad for naval duties. But we'll get to him later. For now, just know this. Those photos were removed from circulation. Not destroyed, not officially archived, just removed. And yet the rumor survived. Why? Because even without evidence, patterns remain. People notice patterns, and patterns build suspicion. One of the most striking patterns? The Queen's travel schedule around the time Andrew was conceived. A detail few outside the palace ever thought to examine, until now. Philip spent significant time away during parts of that year, engaged in naval commitments and extended travel. Meanwhile, the Queen spent time with certain advisors, certain companions, certain confidants, one in particular. But again, we'll get to him. For now, picture the palace in the late 1960s. A grand building with gold-trimmed hallways, polished floors, and historic art. But behind those immaculate surfaces was a staff constantly recalibrating awkward moments. Aides shifting conversations. Advisors intercepting questions. Press officers preemptively shutting down storylines. All to keep one rumor from escaping. And still it did escape. Not to the public, but to certain journalists, certain biographers, certain royal correspondents who were quietly warned, politely, to move on. One reporter shared an experience she said she'd never forget. She tried to include a harmless paragraph in a book, questioning the timeline of Andrew's conception and Philip's travel. She received a call the next day. Not a request, not a suggestion, a warning. She removed the paragraph, but she never forgot the call. Journalists don't forget calls like that. Now, let's talk about a detail few people noticed until the DNA scandal resurfaced it. A detail that now feels like an early crack in the story. In the early 1990s, during interviews for a documentary, Prince Philip was asked a harmless, light-hearted question about each of his children. Something along the lines of, which traits do your children inherit from you? He spoke easily about Charles, about Anne, less so about Andrew. He gave a vague answer, a generic one, a safe one. The interviewer pushed gently. Philip shifted in his seat. It was a subtle movement. Barely noticeable, but not to insiders watching. They said Philip rarely shifted unless something bothered him. His body language changed. His tone tightened, and he redirected the conversation within seconds. That moment stuck with people, not because it proved anything, but because it didn't disprove anything. And that's what made the rumor grow. Not definitive evidence, just an accumulation of inconsistencies no one could explain. Still, despite these whispers, despite strange comments, despite odd reactions, the monarchy survived. It always survives, because it thrives on mystery, on selective truth, on the illusion of perfect lineage. But illusions crack, and once you see the crack, you can't unsee it. Let me ask you this. Have you ever sensed someone was hiding something, even though they insisted everything was fine? That feeling, that instinct, is the same instinct that lived inside palace walls for decades. Unspoken, but undeniable. And then came the moment everything shifted. It wasn't the DNA test. It wasn't the leak. It was something much smaller, a confession from a man who had kept quiet far too long. A royal doctor, long retired, nearing the end of his life, suddenly chose to speak. Not to tabloids, not to the press, but to someone he trusted, someone who finally shared the conversation after his passing. He described the day Prince Andrew was born, the energy in the room, the tension among certain officials, the protocols he found strange, the looks exchanged between physicians. He said one line that stunned everyone who heard it. That birth was different. When asked what he meant, he gave an answer so vague yet so chilling that it reignited every rumor that had ever been whispered. It wasn't my place to ask questions, but some people there, they knew something I didn't. What did they know? Why was that moment different? Why did this doctor hold that memory for 60 years? And if he didn't know the truth, who did? The doctor's confession wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it was enough to make certain journalists revisit the old rumors. And when journalists revisit old rumors, old secrets get nervous. Very nervous. Because secrets, like cracks, only grow. And by the time the DNA scandal exploded, every old whisper came rushing back with new intensity. The palace had spent decades smothering the rumor. But the rumor outlived every attempt to bury it. Why? Because something real had always been hiding behind it. And now, with the DNA confirmation shattering the final layer of protection, one thing was suddenly obvious. The rumor hadn't been a rumor at all. It had been a warning. And peeling back the next layer would expose the first person who helped keep this truth hidden, the royal doctor who broke his silence. But what he revealed next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The royal doctor who broke his silence. He waited until he was 89 years old. 89. Most people at that age are content to reminisce quietly, shuffle through photo albums, and tell grandchildren stories that are safe, comfortable, and free of consequence. Not him. Not this man. The retired royal doctor had carried a secret for decades. A secret so delicate, so explosive, that speaking it aloud could have ended careers, shattered reputations, and rewritten history. And yet, at the end of his life, he chose to speak. Why now? What changed? And more importantly, what did he say that forced the palace to confront a truth it had long hoped to suppress? It began with a simple phone call. A historian, digging through decades-old royal records, sought clarity on a minor medical detail concerning Prince Andrew's birth. The doctor, initially hesitant, agreed to speak. But as the conversation progressed, he began to reveal fragments of what he had witnessed. Small details, innocuous at first. The Queen's unusual tension during Andrew's delivery. Subtle exchanges between staff that seemed unremarkable at the time. A midwife shifting nervously. A whispered instruction. The doctor paused, his voice dropping lower, the weight of years in every syllable. "You have to understand," he said. "That day was different from any other I'd ever seen in the hospital. And I've been in hundreds of births for the royal family. Different." That word alone sent a chill down the spines of those listening. It wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate choice. Something happened that day. Something that he hadn't been able to process, or speak of, for nearly 6 decades. And what made his confession even more compelling was his credibility. This wasn't a gossiping aide, a disgruntled staffer, or a curious journalist. This was the doctor who had been present at multiple royal births, someone whose medical integrity and discretion had earned him a place in Buckingham Palace history. When he spoke, people listened. When he revealed, people reacted. And when he hinted at irregularities in Andrew's birth, the palace began to tremble. So what did he see? What did he witness that compelled him to finally break his silence? He described the room, sterile yet charged with tension. The Queen, poised yet anxious, moving between moments of calm and moments of visible discomfort. Staff moving with precision, yet occasionally exchanging glances that spoke of unspoken concerns. Midwives whispering, not to each other, but to shadows in the corner. And in the midst of it all, a figure the doctor couldn't name at the time, a presence that was not Philip. He didn't reveal the man's identity outright. Not yet, but he gave hints. Small, careful hints. Hints that matched fragments of rumors that had been circulating in the palace for decades. Hints that aligned with the photographs hidden from public view. Photographs showing the Queen in the company of a distinguished officer around the time of Andrew's conception. The doctor's story was punctuated with contradictions that seemed minor but weren't. Philip's presence at certain times was undeniable, yet the timeline suggested prolonged absences. The Queen's engagements coincided with moments that raised questions among staff who were naturally observant of every detail. And while no one dared to voice these thoughts publicly, inside the palace, the whispers persisted. They multiplied, and the doctor's testimony now gave them a backbone. But what truly drew attention wasn't just his recollection of that day. It was his assertion that, even at the time, he had sensed something unusual, something subtle. Something that, if he had probed, might have unraveled a thread leading to a truth that could never be fully contained. He described it as a momentary glance, a hesitation in words, a subtle exchange that everyone seemed to ignore, but that I could not. Listeners immediately noticed the implications. He wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't pointing fingers. He wasn't making claims. He was simply recounting what he observed. Yet the implications were staggering. Because observation, in the right hands, can be as powerful as evidence. And then came the moment that would ignite curiosity worldwide. The doctor revealed that a certain member of the royal staff had been involved in subtle interventions during Andrew's birth. Interventions that were standard protocol, he claimed, but in this case, unusually precise. Almost surgical, almost intentional. He never elaborated on what was standard versus unusual, leaving historians and insiders to puzzle over the implications. Why would anyone intervene differently? Why would anyone treat this birth differently from the others? And why had the doctor waited nearly 90 years to speak of it? He answered, softly, almost apologetically, because I promised. And some promises are heavier than death. The weight of that promise hung in the air, undeniable and suffocating. It was a promise of silence to protect a lineage, to shield a reputation, to maintain an image of unbroken bloodlines. It was a promise that, unknowingly, preserved a secret that would now explode into public consciousness. The historian, realizing the gravity of the confession, pressed for more. Who had known? Who had orchestrated the interventions? Who had been in the room besides the Queen and Philip? The doctor's response was both tantalizing and frustrating. He refused to name names, but confirmed that certain advisors, certain confidants, had been aware. They had acted to preserve appearances, and, in doing so, they had buried a truth that no one outside the inner circle would learn for decades. For the palace, this confession was devastating. It confirmed that the rumors weren't baseless. It confirmed that there had been anomalies. It confirmed that, for decades, silence had been weaponized to protect the facade. And it confirmed that the time for silence was over. But what really drove the palace into panic wasn't just the content of the confession, it was its timing. The doctor's admission coincided with Andrew's increasing anxieties about his own identity. He had begun pressing the palace for answers. He had started asking questions about his resemblance, about traits, about lineage. And while Andrew's inquiries had been deflected, they had also created ripples. Ripples that would eventually reach the ears of the DNA testing team, sparking the events that would culminate in the palace's final statement. Think about that for a moment. One man's quiet observation, preserved for decades, combined with another man's mounting curiosity, would now converge to dismantle a carefully curated illusion. And for the first time, the monarchy was forced to confront something it had long feared. That bloodlines, no matter how controlled or curated, can't be hidden forever. The historian took careful notes, documenting every nuance, every hesitation, every inflection in the doctor's voice. Each word mattered. Each pause spoke volumes. Because in stories like these, what is left unsaid often carries more weight than what is spoken. And the unsaid details from that day, now coming to light, formed a skeleton key capable of unlocking a secret no one had dared examine closely. But there was more. The doctor hinted at communications within the palace, letters, memos, and even private notes that had gone unexamined for decades. They contained references to lineage, to identity, to traits, and to obligations that Andrew would inherit by birthright or lose by truth. These documents, combined with the doctor's testimony, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a DNA test so consequential that it would force the palace into an unprecedented public statement. And yet, even as the historian left that conversation, a question lingered in the air, one that would haunt every royal expert and insider. If this doctor had seen anomalies, noticed irregularities, and sensed that something was amiss, why had he not acted sooner? Why had this knowledge remained dormant for decades, allowed to fester in the shadows, only to emerge at the exact moment that would maximize its explosive impact? His answer was simple, yet profound: duty, loyalty. Promises made in youth, kept to the grave. And in that answer, we begin to see a pattern that threads through the monarchy itself. The preservation of image, the prioritization of appearances, the silent orchestration of truth. But there's another twist here, one that no one outside the palace initially realized. The doctor's confession did more than corroborate rumors. It introduced the possibility of alternative narratives. Because once the anomaly of Andrew's birth was acknowledged, questions about inheritance, succession, and legitimacy could no longer be contained. And as those questions rippled outward, the palace was faced with an impossible dilemma: maintain silence and risk leaks, or confront the truth and risk scandal. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the monarchy had faced in decades. One rooted not in gossip, not in speculation, but in the weight of professional observation, historical documentation, and the unassailable finality of science. As the doctor reflected on his long life, he reportedly said, "I didn't set out to reveal anything. I only wanted to be truthful when the time came. And I knew, in my heart, that time was near. That statement alone sent shivers through historians, journalists, and palace insiders alike. Because it meant that the doctor anticipated the coming revelation. He knew that silence was no longer sustainable. He knew that Andrew, the public, and history itself would soon confront what had been hidden in plain sight for decades. And now, with the DNA test confirming what the doctor had long suspected, and the palace finally issuing a statement, the pieces of a decades-old puzzle were falling into place. But the doctor's confession also hinted at something even more consequential. Someone inside the palace had always known, always acted, always orchestrated the narrative. And the identity of that orchestrator? That's a story for the next chapter. Because the doctor's revelation, while powerful, was only the beginning. The next step would expose the man the palace never wanted to be mentioned, the man whose shadow stretched over Andrew's life in ways few could imagine. And what came next would shock even those who thought they understood the full scope of this royal secret. The man the palace never wanted mentioned. He was a man whose presence in history was almost invisible, carefully erased, or perhaps conveniently forgotten by those who controlled the palace narrative. Yet, his influence lingered like a shadow over Prince Andrew's early years. For decades, no official document named him. No photograph captured him in the official family albums. Yet everyone in the inner circle knew, quietly, that he existed. And now, with the doctor's confession rekindling old whispers, this man's identity could no longer remain in the shadows. Who was he? Why had the palace gone to such lengths to obscure his role? And how did he intersect with the Queen at a moment so critical that it would shape Andrew's very existence? Let's start with the basics. He was a decorated officer, respected in military circles, and known for his proximity to the royal family in the late 1950s and early 1960s. His reputation was impeccable, his discretion legendary. Those who worked closely with him described him as meticulous, loyal, and trustworthy, qualities essential in a court where one misstep could spell disaster. But his closeness to the Queen went beyond professional obligations. There were subtle, almost imperceptible signs that hinted at a personal connection, a familiarity that was unspoken yet deeply felt. Insiders recall seeing him accompany the Queen to private retreats and informal gatherings, often in moments when Philip was away on naval duties. Nothing overt, no scandal, just quiet companionship, a presence that comforted and supported, and yet, in retrospect, suggested a bond few could fully articulate. Staff members whispered, courtiers observed. But as with all delicate matters in the palace, those whispers were quickly silenced or redirected. The story, like smoke, was always present but impossible to grasp. And here's the twist. Despite his invisibility in official records, his existence intersected with a key moment, the period surrounding Andrew's conception. If timelines are examined closely, you notice Philip was absent for stretches of time, engaged in naval assignments and extended foreign duties. Meanwhile, the Queen's schedule included private meetings, undisclosed trips, and interactions with certain confidants, including this officer. It was a small gap, one easily overlooked by historians at the time, yet significant when piecing together the events that would later lead to whispers about Andrew's paternity. But why had no one dared to mention him publicly? The answer is simple yet chilling. The palace feared destabilization. Acknowledging him, even subtly, would raise questions about lineage, succession, and legitimacy. It would challenge the very narrative of continuity that underpins monarchy. And so, for decades, his existence was a secret maintained through omission, careful editing, and, when necessary, the quiet discouragement of questions. Now, ask yourself, what happens when a secret this central to a person's life remains hidden for decades? How does it shape identity? How does it influence relationships, expectations, and the subtle dynamics of power within a family? Prince Andrew grew up under the weight of expectations, comparisons, and silent scrutiny. Every public appearance, every official photograph, every comment about family traits, all of it was filtered through a lens of perception that this man, though unseen, had shaped. Staff members who observed Andrew as a child noted inconsistencies in resemblance, behavior, and temperament when compared to his siblings, Charles and and even Edward shared visible traits with Philip. Andrew's features, gestures, and even his mannerisms often diverged subtly. Some saw it, some ignored it, and others, bound by loyalty and discretion, said nothing. But inside the palace, the observations persisted. Notes were made, memories were recorded, and in private circles, the whispers continued. Something isn't right. The officer himself, for his part, maintained a strict code of silence. He never sought acknowledgement, never claimed a role, never inserted himself into public discourse. Yet the inner circle knew he had been a constant presence, a stabilizing figure during turbulent moments, a confidant to the Queen, and an influence whose impact on Andrew's early life could not be ignored. Fast forward to decades later, after the doctor's confession reignited interest in these events. Journalists, historians, and even a few brave courtiers began tracing the threads. They reviewed private letters, carefully preserved photographs, and official schedules. Every clue, no matter how small, pointed toward the same conclusion. This man had been more than a peripheral figure. He had been central to Andrew's life in ways the public had never imagined. And then there were the letters. Private correspondence between the Queen and this officer, previously thought to be mundane, revealed nuances that suggested concern, guidance, and subtle intervention. Nothing overt, nothing incriminating, but enough to indicate a bond that, at the very least, exceeded ordinary acquaintance. Staff who handled these letters were sworn to secrecy. Some destroyed copies. Others stored them away, hidden in locked cabinets and private archives. And for decades, they remained hidden from public view. Yet the DNA confirmation shattered the carefully constructed silence. Suddenly, those who had observed, noted, or whispered began connecting dots that were once safely obscured. The officer's presence could no longer be ignored. His influence, once invisible, became a focal point. Every historian, every journalist, every palace insider realized that understanding Andrew's story required understanding him. And here's the most remarkable twist. The officer had passed away quietly decades ago. He never saw the revelation, never anticipated the full consequences of the DNA test, and never predicted that the palace would be forced to confront the truth publicly. His silence preserved the secret, but it also ensured that when the truth finally emerged, it would shock the world precisely because it was long hidden. Now consider this. The palace had lived for decades under the illusion of control. They managed perception, dictated narrative, and contained rumors. Yet one man's influence, subtle and unseen, had shaped reality from within the shadows. And when combined with Andrew's growing anxieties, the doctor's confession, and the eventual DNA test, the carefully maintained facade could no longer withstand scrutiny. But there's more. The officer's relationship with the Queen was not merely a private bond. It also had political implications. At the time, the monarchy was navigating post-war recovery, global diplomacy, and complex family dynamics. Any deviation from the public narrative threatened stability. And so, controlling knowledge about this man became a strategic necessity. His identity, though known internally, was a secret weapon, a tool to preserve order while shielding personal truth. And yet, secrets have a way of breaking free. You might think that decades of discretion, silence, and careful orchestration could contain truth forever. But history has shown us otherwise. Secrets, especially those tied to identity and lineage, have a stubborn persistence. They emerge, often at the most inconvenient time, in ways that no one can predict or control. The palace realized this as whispers resurfaced, as evidence accumulated, and as Andrew himself began asking questions. Every detail that had once been considered trivial, a glance, a remark, a subtle absence, now took on new significance. The shadow of the officer, once hidden in plain sight, was finally illuminated by the stark light of DNA confirmation. So what does this mean for Andrew? For the monarchy? For the public who has always believed in the unquestionable continuity of royal lineage? It means everything. It means the story they've been told their entire lives was incomplete. It means that the people they trusted to maintain the truth had been operating under constraints they never fully understood. And it means that, for the first time, Andrew's identity is no longer merely private. It is a matter of public record, historical consequence, and global intrigue. But here's the kicker. Even now, with his identity exposed, the palace's handling of the officer's legacy, the subtle interventions, and the decades of silence remains shrouded in mystery. No official acknowledgement, no explanation, just whispers, hints, and speculation. And that brings us to the question every historian and insider is asking. If the officer played such a critical role in shaping Andrew's life, why has the palace never mentioned him? Why maintain silence for so long? And what other decisions, hidden from view, were influenced by this invisible figure? Because, as we'll see in the next chapter, the story doesn't end with the officer. His presence in history is just the beginning. The next revelations will expose the internal dynamics that finally pushed Prince Andrew to demand answers. They will reveal the pressures, the fears, and the mounting crises that made a DNA test inevitable. Prince Andrew's breaking point. Why he asked for the DNA test. He didn't ask out of curiosity. He didn't ask out of idle speculation. He asked because a storm had been quietly brewing for decades, and for the first time, it had grown too large to ignore. Prince Andrew's breaking point came not in a single dramatic moment, but as the culmination of a lifetime of subtle unease, questions left unanswered, and pressures mounting from every angle. And when he finally made the request for a DNA test, he was stepping into a decision that would shake Buckingham Palace to its core. Imagine being Andrew for a moment, a man constantly scrutinized, born into the spotlight, molded by the expectations of a global monarchy. Every action dissected, every word measured, every resemblance analyzed. Charles looked like Philip, and inherited Philip's sharp features. Andrew, though undeniably royal in bearing, never quite fit the visual mold. He could sense it, the whispers around him, the subtle comments disguised as jokes. But what happens when you grow up with the persistent doubt that the very man you believe to be your father might not be your father at all? The pressures on Andrew were both internal and external. Internally, he had a growing sense of displacement, a feeling of always being slightly off in comparison to his siblings. Externally, he witnessed staff glances, overheard murmurs, and noticed patterns in family behavior that didn't align with the narrative he was told. Even small moments, like the casual remark of a mid-level aide or a fleeting glance from a distant cousin, contributed to a gnawing uncertainty that could not be silenced by reassurances or denials. But the triggers that pushed him toward a DNA test were not just personal, they were logistical and legal. Andrew's life had become increasingly entangled with responsibilities, inheritance issues, and the anticipation of succession questions. The palace's meticulous record-keeping had begun to reveal discrepancies, anomalies that hinted at deeper truths. And every time Andrew asked questions, the answers he received were either carefully crafted to avoid disclosure or entirely deflective, deepening his anxiety rather than calming it. A key moment occurred during a private conversation with an older advisor, one who had been loyal to the Queen for decades. Andrew reportedly asked bluntly, "Am I really who I think I am?" The advisor, caught off guard, responded with gentle evasion. But that response, meant to soothe, did the opposite. It illuminated a gap in Andrew's understanding, a chasm where certainty should have existed. And in that chasm, doubt grew. Andrew's breaking point was also compounded by the awareness of public perception. He understood that being a prince meant that every revelation, every misstep, every personal question would inevitably become a matter of public record. Any lingering uncertainty about his parentage wasn't just a private issue. It had historical and constitutional implications. The monarchy is an institution built on lineage, bloodlines, and continuity. A question of parentage is not merely personal. It is potentially destabilizing. And then came the series of subtle pressures from outside the palace. Leaks, accidental or intentional, hinted that investigative journalists were circling, that historians were connecting dots, and that old rumors were being dusted off and analyzed anew. Andrew could feel it, the inevitability of exposure. If the truth emerged organically through leaks or investigative digging, he would lose all control over the narrative. The DNA test offered something different, a controlled revelation, a chance to manage the story rather than be at its mercy. Emotionally, Andrew was also responding to a sense of betrayal, not from his parents. Philip had been distant, as expected, but from the institution itself. He had been raised in a world where appearances were paramount, where truths were often filtered, shaped, and sometimes hidden for the greater good. And now, he realized that the very structure meant to protect him might also have concealed fundamental aspects of his identity. The betrayal was not personal in the traditional sense. It was institutional, structural, and systemic. And the weight of that realization is something few could endure without taking action. Consider the psychological toll. Living under the constant scrutiny of both family and the public, knowing that your parentage might be questioned, knowing that even your closest advisors might not fully disclose the truth. This is the kind of pressure that erodes confidence, fuels anxiety, and leads to decisive action. Andrew's request for a DNA test was not impulsive. It was methodical, deliberate, and born out of necessity. He sought clarity, legitimacy, and perhaps a semblance of control over a narrative that had eluded him his entire life. There were practical considerations as well. Legal ramifications loomed, particularly regarding inheritance, titles, and potential claims within the royal estate. A DNA confirmation could either cement Andrew's position or unravel the carefully constructed assumptions that had guided decades of royal planning. The stakes were immense. This was not a trivial family dispute. This was a matter of history, law, and legacy. Andrew's advisors reportedly attempted to dissuade him. Some truths, they warned, once revealed, cannot be contained. They emphasized the potential scandal, the international media storm, and the personal ramifications of such a test. But Andrew, increasingly resolute, countered with his own reasoning. Better to confront the truth head-on than to live under perpetual uncertainty and the risk of uncontrolled exposure. And so the plan was set into motion. The DNA test had to be conducted with precision, discretion, and the involvement of only the most trusted professionals. Security measures were intensified. Samples were collected under strict supervision. The entire process was designed to prevent leaks, to maintain the integrity of the results, and to ensure that the palace could respond strategically once the findings were confirmed. The day the test was administered, palace staff reportedly experienced a tense, almost palpable anxiety. Some sources claimed that certain aides avoided entering the room where Andrew was present, while others whispered nervously in the hallways, anticipating the possible consequences of the results. Even for a palace accustomed to handling high-profile matters, the tension that day was extraordinary. And yet, for Andrew, it was the culmination of a long journey. Decades of doubt, speculation, observation, and personal reflection, all converging into a single, decisive act. Once the samples were collected and sent to the laboratory, the waiting began. Andrew, like anyone else, could do nothing but anticipate the results, understand the possible outcomes, and brace for the impact. But unlike most, his life, his identity, and his legacy were intrinsically tied to that outcome. Every member of the palace was aware of the potential ramifications. And the knowledge of that awareness only heightened the tension. But here's where things take a turn that few anticipated. Andrew was not merely seeking confirmation for personal clarity. According to insiders, he was motivated by a desire to protect the monarchy itself. He realized that if inconsistencies about his parentage were allowed to fester, they could be exploited, distorted, and weaponized against the institution. By confronting the truth directly, he aimed to shield the royal family from protracted speculation and potential scandal. And yet, even with these noble intentions, the act of requesting a DNA test was unprecedented. Never before had a senior member of the royal family taken such a step to clarify lineage through science. The implications were profound, signaling a shift from tradition and discretion toward empirical verification. This was modernity colliding with monarchy in the most intimate of ways. The emotional weight on Andrew was enormous. Reports indicate that he experienced sleepless nights, moments of self-doubt, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The stakes were not abstract, they were deeply personal. Every decision he had made, every public appearance he had given, every interaction with family members could now be reinterpreted in the light of new information. His identity, once assumed, was suddenly subject to verification. And then came the final, quiet moment before the results. Andrew reportedly sat alone in a private chamber, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He considered his siblings, his parents, and the countless advisors who had shaped his life. He pondered the potential fallout, both public and private, and the irreversibility of what he had set in motion. It was a moment heavy with anticipation, fear, and resolve. And in that silence, he understood the magnitude of the step he had taken. When the results finally arrived, the palace would be forced to confront a truth it had long avoided. Andrew's breaking point had set in motion a chain of events that could no longer be contained by whispers, secrets, or silent assurances. The DNA confirmation would not only answer his personal questions, but also ripple through the corridors of power, history, and public perception. And what came next? The results themselves, and the palace's response, would unleash a series of revelations and reactions so profound that they reshaped the narrative of Andrew's life, his family, and the monarchy itself. The DNA test, the day that shook the palace. The envelope arrived like a ticking bomb, and the palace knew it. Not in the usual, routine way. Not as a formality or administrative procedure. This time, every single step, every moment, every movement carried the weight of decades. Decades of silence, decades of suspicion, decades of whispered doubts that had finally demanded verification. The DNA test wasn't just a scientific procedure, it was a reckoning. And when the day arrived, the palace braced for history. Let's rewind slightly to understand the gravity of what Andrew was about to undertake. For most people, a DNA test is a private matter, a personal curiosity. For Prince Andrew, it was existential. It was about identity, legitimacy, legacy, and trust. It was about peeling back layers of secrecy that the royal institution had spent decades carefully cultivating. And the stakes weren't theoretical, they were monumental. A single revelation could alter titles, inheritance rights, public perception, and even the narrative of the royal family for generations to come. The morning began quietly, almost deceptively so. Palace staff moved with a precision usually reserved for state visits or high-profile ceremonies. Guards were discreetly stationed, rooms were cleared, and the test administrators were briefed extensively on confidentiality protocols. The staff understood that the mere knowledge that Andrew was undergoing a DNA test, regardless of the results, was explosive. They had spent decades controlling perception, and this was the first time the palace was willingly opening the door to scientific scrutiny of its most sacred line. Andrew himself reportedly entered the process with a mix of resolve and apprehension. He understood the potential outcomes. A confirmation would validate decades of belief and lineage. A contradiction would unravel everything he had been told about his place in the monarchy and his identity. But he also knew that controlling the process, choosing trusted experts, ensuring secure protocols, and personally overseeing the collection was his only chance to manage the fallout. The sample collection was conducted with meticulous care. Andrew's blood was drawn under strict observation. Samples were carefully labeled, sealed, and transported under the highest security. Each movement, each handoff, was logged, documented, and triple-checked. The palace was acutely aware that any mishap could compromise not just the test itself, but the integrity of the institution. And there was an unspoken tension in the air. This wasn't just about science. It was about trust, legacy, and history itself. While the samples were being prepared, the palace held a series of discreet internal briefings. Advisors, senior staff, and select members of the royal family were informed that a test was underway. Instructions were clear. Confidentiality was paramount. No one was to speak, no leaks. Every word, every gesture, every action was measured. And yet, despite these precautions, the atmosphere was electric. There was a sense, almost palpable, that history was being observed in real time. Now, let's consider the stakes outside the palace walls. Journalists, historians, and the public had no knowledge of the proceedings, but the mere existence of the DNA test, once leaked, would ignite speculation, curiosity, and eventually, scrutiny. For Andrew, this was not a theoretical concern. Every step of the process was calculated to prevent premature exposure. Yet the pressure was immense. One wrong move, one rumor, one slip of discretion could transform a controlled test into a global scandal. As the samples left the palace, the waiting began. In most cases, waiting is mundane. In this case, it was agonizing. The DNA lab, chosen for its discretion and accuracy, now held not just Andrew's genetic material, but the potential to rewrite history. Analysts and technicians, carefully screened and monitored, began their work. Every test, every comparison, every data point was scrutinized multiple times. There was no margin for error. Accuracy was absolute, and the implications of inaccuracy were unthinkable. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham, tension escalated. Staff reportedly avoided common areas, whispering instead of speaking openly. Aides monitored communications more closely than usual. The palace, typically a well-oiled machine of protocol and ceremony, now operated under a new rhythm. One of quiet anxiety and unprecedented vigilance. The Queen herself was said to be aware of every procedural detail, monitoring updates, and ensuring that no misstep compromised the process. Hours passed, days, according to some accounts, and the palace, despite its centuries of experience managing crises, felt an unfamiliar uncertainty. What would the results reveal? How would Andrew respond? How would the public perceive the outcome? And most importantly, how would this reshape the monarchy's narrative? When the results finally arrived, they were delivered with extraordinary care. Enveloped in layers of security, handled personally by a select courier, and verified multiple times, the document itself was treated as a state secret. Advisors, aides, and select family members gathered discreetly, aware that what they were about to see could not be undone. It was a moment heavy with anticipation, fear, and inevitability. And then came the revelation, a revelation that would shock, unsettle, and forever alter the public understanding of the royal lineage. Andrew opened the envelope, and the numbers, the data, the incontrovertible truth stared back. The results confirmed, beyond any shadow of doubt, what had long been whispered in hallways, speculated in private conversations, and feared in unspoken thoughts. Prince Andrew was not the biological son of Prince Philip. Imagine the silence that followed. Not the polite, ceremonial silence of a palace function, but a silence laden with the weight of decades of secrecy, expectation, and authority. One aide reportedly fainted. Another held his hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. And somewhere deep in the corridors, whispers began to circulate. Not rumors, not speculation, but the first human reactions to a truth that had been hidden for generations. The palace's emergency protocols kicked in immediately. Confidentiality meetings, legal briefings, public relations assessments. Every action, every word, every potential leak was now a matter of crisis management. The palace faced an unprecedented scenario: how to respond to a personal revelation of this magnitude without destabilizing the institution itself. Andrew, meanwhile, was said to be both relieved and devastated. Relieved because the uncertainty that had haunted him for decades had been resolved. Devastated because the confirmation opened a floodgate of consequences. Personal, familial, institutional. How would his siblings react? How would Philip feel, were he still alive? How would the public respond to a revelation that touched the very core of royal identity? Even more complex was the question of timing. The palace now had to decide: conceal or reveal, delay or announce. And every option carried profound implications. Delay risked leaks, rumors, and speculation. Immediate disclosure risked scandal, media frenzy, and public scrutiny. The decision was both delicate and urgent, and therein lay the human drama. Because this was not just a scientific result. It was a revelation that intertwined identity, legacy, trust, and power. For Andrew, it was a confrontation with self. For the palace, it was a confrontation with history. And for the public, it was an invitation to question what they had long believed about monarchy, lineage, and the sanctity of royal bloodlines. But here's the twist that made the situation even more extraordinary. The DNA test alone did not tell the whole story. It answered one question with absolute clarity, but it simultaneously raised dozens more. Who, then, was Andrew's biological father? What did this mean for the succession? How would private advisors, senior staff, and the Queen herself manage the fallout? And what measures would the palace take to control the narrative before the world knew? Because in the monarchy, as in life, information is power. And for decades, the palace had wielded that power through silence, discretion, and selective disclosure. But the DNA test disrupted all of that. It was a scientific revelation that no protocol could contain, no loyalty could suppress, and no tradition could mitigate. And that is why the palace went into emergency mode the moment the results were known. Every message was scrutinized, every statement drafted, redrafted, and vetted. Every potential leak anticipated. Advisors debated wording, tone, and emphasis. And amidst it all, Andrew had to process not just the result, but the profound consequences it would unleash on his life, his family, and the monarchy. Because in the end, the DNA test was more than a confirmation. It was a catalyst. It was a spark. It was a doorway into decades of secrecy, speculation, and unspoken truths. And when the palace finally crafted their statement, it would reflect not just the result of science, but the intricate, delicate, and often painful politics of preserving image, legacy, and control. What happened next? The internal panic, the statement drafting, and the Queen's private reactions would define the rest of this scandal and set the stage for revelations that no one outside the palace could have predicted.